Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining our discussion. This will be our last breakout of our summit, so this is pretty exciting opportunity. I'd like to invite you to join me in welcoming Taiha Wagner. She's a PMO leader at uCare, Minnesota. She brings deep expertise in bridging strategy and execution with a focus on designing operating models that turn intent into measurable outcomes. Today in this session, we're going to be talking about translating strategy into structure. And Taiha will share expertise, practical insights on aligning operating models to strategy to enable clarity, accountability, and sustainable outcomes. So with that, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate your help. Boy, how long has it been since we've all been at a conference or presenting after we've all been working remote for years, right? I had to, once I started going back into the office, I had to purchase new work clothes. You know, that COVID time, I think we all expanded a little bit and we're like, when's the last time I put on a suit? I sent my team a picture this morning and they're like, you're dressed up. And I'm like, I'm out in public. Yeah. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for having me here. Before we kind of get started on this, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Do we have any musicians in the room? Ooh, just one. Just one. Do we have any former? Hey, how about any kind of instrument? Did you ever take lessons or play anything, maybe even as far back as high school? Okay. Anybody, any of those musicians by chance had been in high school marching band? Yay, my bandies, you're my tribe. All right, so I'm gonna, you are first to raise your hand. What did you play? Nice. Okay, very nice. So when you were in marching band, you had to wear a uniform, did you not? Can you tell? Oh, I need a mic for the recording, if we can use the microphone. Thank you.
And
that's right.
That is now
and for
recorded.
The rest of the presentation, she will be giving a performance. So you wore a uniform to be in marching band.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, and especially those of us who haven't been in marching band, what that uniform entails?
Well, the high school uniform, I did college too, but the high school uniform, blue polyester pants with a white racing stripe up the side, white, like fake leather shoes that had to be polished, gleaming white, so they could see every error you made in a step, a white polyester shirt with an ascot, and then a felt, like cowboy pirate type hat with a yellow big plumy feather sticking out of it.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of DCI. So the uniforms have changed a little bit, thank goodness. Now, when you were in high school marching band and you had to get fit for your uniform, I would imagine there were probably some volunteers to help the whole band.
Yep, the parents were there.
Yes. So thank you for sharing that example. And believe it or not, high school marching band does translate into operating models. So let me tell you a little bit of a story of how sometimes some of us think in operating models inherently, right? It's just the way we navigate through the world is through, how can this be better? What are we doing? How can this be better? How can we improve a process? So two of my kids are music kids. One of them was my biggest marching band kid. And so I was the mother who was helping fit the kids into the marching band uniforms. And we used to, it was a big band at the time, it was 175 kids. And they all needed to be on the field and they all needed to look the same. And these kids are also growing year over year. So the uniform that they started with freshman year certainly wasn't the uniform that they finished with senior year, because you grow a ton in high school. And so we needed to get 175 kids fitted with these uniforms, and each of them need to have their own shoes and all of that too. And so we would, as the parents, all the uniforms were stored in the basement of the high school. We would bring hundreds of uniforms up to the choir area where we fit all the kids, right? And so it was a lot of work hauling all this gear. They have all the hats. Each kid needs to be fitted with the hat and assigned to it. And it was a huge effort for the volunteers. The kids, quite frankly, didn't care. They were just like, okay, here I am, Mrs. Wagner. What do you want me to do? They weren't too invested. That process was sort of happening to them. And they were the benefactors of the process, but they weren't real invested in it. So me, as more of that process-oriented thinker, sat down with the rest of the parents volunteering saying, look, this is great. We know what needs to happen. Why are we the ones doing all the heavy lifting here? Why are we hauling all these uniforms up from the basement of this high school and getting all this done, and anything that didn't fit or didn't get used, we had to haul all back down? So said, anybody open to changing a process? Whew, you want to talk about legacy marching band parent volunteers. That is a demographic that's deeply rooted and committed in their process. Because it's a volunteer role. There's no, right? You're not getting paid for it. But a lot of those volunteers really get a lot of secondary gain. It's where they really get their significance in their volunteer era with their kids. So tough customers to try and change minds. So I say, interesting idea. What if? Would you consider bringing the kids down to the uniforms instead of bringing all the uniforms to the kids? Because the kids don't care. And so we did. We gave it a trial. Worked magically. After we're all done, the parents are like, God, why haven't we done that before? I'm like, right? Why haven't we done that before? Because what it takes often is a fresh perspective in an already existing process in order to get new eyes on it and to propose new ideas. Luckily, I was working with a group of people who were open to a new idea. Not always the case in corporate, right? Pretty invested in the processes. All right, this is the boring part. I rubbed a little AI on the picture. You can see it does look a little bit like me, right? I really turn vision into working systems that deliver. So my role has been, I come from a project management lens, but I also come from a coaching lens. I've been a coach for over 20 years. And so as you're thinking about all of these frameworks and ways of doing things, if you can't get the people to the table to do it, how effective is it, right? And so the coaching piece is always, always an important part of the change management. All right, so translating strategy into structure. The operating models are just the invisible architecture, different kind of architecture than maybe what you're putting together. It's the invisible structure that helps things get done. And if you really want to break it down to its simplest form, it can be just a group of processes that we've all agreed on. However, we have to remain flexible. So going back to my music analogy, I kind of think about this as jazz. Jazz has a structure to it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But jazz also has a lot of improvisation. And we have to be able to allow for improvisation and the uniqueness of teams and organizations to be able to design effective operating models and be willing to change them. So when we design an operating model, we can't get too married to it, right? We put forth all this energy of designing, and then we put it to work, and sometimes it doesn't work very well. And we're like, but we spent so much time, we invested so much in designing this. But if it doesn't work, what's the point? So we also have to remember that we need to be flexible and we need to adapt. So really what I do, you guys have been working and thinking this week all about strategy and how to design the strategy and really what needs to be accomplished. I'm taking that strategy and bringing it down to the teams that are executing the work. How are we going to get this done? And so we have the clear intent. The strategy is already articulated. The breakdown happens more so in the day-to-day implementation of the strategy. But it's not really about the talent. It's really about how did we plan this work to flow? These often, and we've heard that in the keynote this morning, these often are not people problems. These are structure problems. So the gap is rarely about talent. Teams work hard, leaders care deeply, and everyone wants to succeed. It's missing structure. So why operating models matter? They help you translate the intent. They convert strategy into concrete action. They shape decisions. They guide flow and accountability patterns, and they make that strategy visible. So if we've set the strategy, where can I go in your org and find that in execution? Can I go to a member of the team who is delivering the strategy and say, tell me how this is coming together for you guys? If we've got an operating model and frameworks, I can say, this is exactly how it flows. This is how our intake process flows. This is how our execution flows. This is how we adapt to change. And these are the outcomes that we're delivering. If you don't have people in your org who you can say, what's this look like in day-to-day? How are we executing? That's an issue. That's a problem. We should be able to watch the work being done in a framework or an operating model to make sure that our strategy is successful. So without those operating models, teams compensate with informal workarounds. That's my favorite. Taiha, how do I know if the operating model is working? Or someone asked me yesterday, how do you know if it's successful? I'm like, I know it's successful when it's adopted, when the work is flowing, when I've got known decision makers who are actually making decisions. I've got people who know what their authority is, and there's not a ton of work happening in the margins. One of the key signals of an operating model that's not working is when people step outside of that framework and work around it. So either you've got a framework that's not necessarily serving you, or you could have some team members going rogue on you. And that's a whole different conversation, right? So signals the structure is missing. Rework. That costs us a lot. Hey, this isn't quite turning out the way this is. Let's go back. Can we get the decision again? Is it the same decision, or are we needing to shift? The rework is one of the most expensive things in delivery. Stalled decisions, or just lack of decision makers, or a lack of willingness of decisions for 100 different reasons. But really, those choices loop endlessly. Unclear ownership. When accountability feels really fuzzy, or no one wants the accountability, therefore won't make the decision, then we just get the big, huge steering committee, the group of everyone. We're gonna lead by consensus. We're not gonna put a stake in the ground and say, hey, this is where we're going, right? So the decisions get stalled, and the unclear ownership. And then again, those informal workarounds. So I'm always looking for who's having side conversations and not using the framework. Does the framework not work, or do we have another problem? Friction is the opportunity. I'd be looking for points where the framework is not working, where the operating model is either not serving or is falling apart. And so it's not usually a people problem. It's usually a lack of structure problem. The signals don't indicate bad teams or poor leadership. They're design signals pointing to gaps. Design signals, friction reveals exactly where structure is needed. Each pain point on a map to improve opportunities. So the fun part for me is looking for natural entry points. And so I'm going to be bringing you back to my marching band story. They had a way of doing things. It was, to all of their knowledge, hey, all the kids got on the field. They put on the show. It works. Yeah, but at what cost, right? So if we're making things more complicated than they need to be, or if we have stakeholders whose needs aren't getting met, I'm looking for places where the friction is happening within processes and within teams and within execution to let me know I need to pay attention to that. So those friction points are your entry points as well. And you don't need leadership to agree to address it. So one of my favorite ways to build frameworks and operating models is from the ground up with the people who are doing the work. Because if it doesn't start there, it's much less likely to be adopted. So with the teams that are boots on the ground, executing the work, getting it done, oh, believe me, if you ever want to know, hey, how come this project's not meeting its deadlines? Ask the people doing the work. They'll tell you why. And you need to step out of yourself enough to be willing to listen and to be willing to say, you know what, you're right. We're doing that terribly. How can we improve it? And what would it cost us? All right, so from strategy to daily work, operating models serve as the critical bridge between strategic direction and operational execution. They translate that high-level intent to a specific mechanism that govern how work flows through the organization. So strategy sets the direction. So you all have been working on where are we going and how we're going to get there. What does the architecture look like? I'm looking at how do we get there through execution. So I'm taking that strategy that is setting the direction we're going, and I'm like, great, how are we going to get there? The models translate the direction. The structure enables the work, and the consistency, it delivers consistency without control. So if I'm building a project management framework and I'm working with the team, this is my favorite part. There's nothing like sitting in a room full of project managers and saying, so what's important? What's important here? How do we want to do this? And while that might seem ambiguous and like, shouldn't leadership tell us how we're going to do this? The people who are doing the work know what works and know how to get things done. And so I would much rather sit with a group of BAs and PMs and say what's important. And what's important not only to this project, but to this organization. Where do we want to set the standards on how we do this together? Because when they are invested in the how we do it and what their own standards are, they're much more likely to adhere to them. And they're much less likely to take that work and pull it out of your operating model and create a workaround. Because they were the ones who said, hey, approval of this charter really, really helps me. So I'm not going to allow work to come in and expand scope without approval and a change order, right? So when they are invested in it, it's much more likely to stay within the framework because they helped build it. So operating models are also great governance frameworks. The work intake, how requests come in. Every organization's a little different, how they manage that, how they're going to prioritize the work, who has decision-making rights, and who is accountable. And so we all need the governance, right? We all need to develop that governance model in how we make decisions, how we manage competing priorities, and what's going to stay in the portfolio and what's going to pop out. And so this governance framework helps us continue to stay together, stay on the same page, and then also in how is this going to be done. So intake in every organization can often be a challenge. Maybe you have a formal intake process where leaders are coming to you saying, hey, we have this initiative, we really need to get it done. And hey, fill out my ServiceNow form, right? Give me your SBAR. Tell me what the ROI is on this. And it's great when that happens and people adhere to a process like that. But how often do you also get maybe leaders reaching out to PMO leaders saying, hey, I have just it's just a minor enhancement. It's not a big deal. And I'm like, well, how much money does your not a big deal cost? And is it in alignment with our strategy? And where does it sit within organizational priorities? And so often, sorry to say it out loud, leadership is often the one that steps out of the framework, because sometimes leadership feels like those frameworks don't apply to me. But they do when you want to deliver on organizational strategy. And so we move them back into the framework. And so that governance model is really important of how these things get done, and continuing to bring leaders back into the governance model that, quite frankly, they also own. So why imposed models fail? And this is really more of a top-down approach. And it's super interesting as we talk about AI. It's not unusual for an organization to say, we're going to be AI, we're going to go AI, we're going to use AI, right? We've been having this conversation, but we didn't ask people actually doing the work. How would AI help you get your job done? What could you just automate? Where can I maximize your human time to deliver more value and use AI to just reduce my administrative lift, right? And so when leaders say, we're going to do this, and it was a top-down approach, not always successful. And so the imposed models fail because it's isolated. You're not looking at where exactly in the organization is this tool going to help us. It's, here's Copilot, awesome, do everything with it. You know, we're going to be able to reduce our team. How many people can we lay off because now we can automate that, right? Those things do fail. I was at a Gartner conference a couple of years ago, and it was right before everything blew up, and it was all the rage. It was everything they talked about, agentic AI. The entire conference was about how AI was going to change our world, and indeed it has. However, this past October, back at the Gartner conference, way different tone. Whoa, I know we were really hounding this a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, what we have found is that over 80% of our AI initiatives are failing. So let's just all pause. Now, that's a pretty big statement coming from an organization like Gartner. But we know this now, right? That was a top-down, drive this initiative. But we didn't talk about it, and we didn't do change management and where it could be effective. So that isolated design really creates, without input from the people who will use it daily. And we skip over a lot. It ignores the pain points. It addresses theoretical concerns instead of actual friction. And the compliance focus is also a continual conversation, right, around AI in particular. But we emphasize following rules over solving real problems. And then they become authority dependent. So top-down models continually go back to the leader and ask for permission, rather than allowing the people doing the work in the operating model to continue to adjust. If you want to, you could say, to be more agile and to be able to fail fast, change direction. We need that level of creative freedom in execution to be able to blow past things that aren't working more quickly. But top-down models don't do that very well. Influence without authority. The most successful operating models spread through influence. And so when people say, how do I know if my operating model is successful? I'd be like, are people using it? Does it have any stick? Did they have any contribution to building it? Is that we're going to start with the friction points that often those people doing the work are aware of and saying, boy, if we could just figure out a better answer for this component, it would be so much easier. Well, let's examine it. So we start with friction points, and we identify the genuine pain points that the teams are experiencing daily. Boy, there's no better way to be a corporate hero than to solve for the pain points that people experience on the daily. We're going to leverage our relationships. We heard that in the keynote this morning with the guys doing the podcast. Boy, if you don't have organizational relationships to help make these changes happen, it's going to be a hard road. You really need to develop and leverage those relationships. And then we're going to line around the problems, build that shared understanding of what challenges are we actually solving. So as we go back to our AI example, I loved the statement of this is a solution looking for a problem. If you can't tell me what problem you're trying to solve, what are we doing here? And so really building that shared understanding of challenges to solve. And then we're positioning it as relief. Frame models as help, not control mechanisms. Now, this can be a little sticky right here, right? Because if you've got a framework and maybe you're tying responsibilities accountability and roles to it, saying, hey, you're in this role. This means you serve these specific functions. Awesome. That lets me know what my responsibility is and what my job is and how I can best serve. But if it's going to be used on the flip side to punish me if I'm not doing it, guess who doesn't want to use a model who they think is going to be used against them? And so we really need to make sure that we're framing these models as help and a way in which the work can flow through them, and not a control mechanism. So what teams see operating models as tools that make their lives easier rather than bureaucratic overhead. All right, just going to check my time here. I know we've got about 20 minutes. We got to get you guys to lunch. All right, why people actually adopt. This is my favorite part. It's grounded in real needs. That also means you're in touch with your teams. You're listening to your teams and understanding what their needs are to deliver the value to your organization and to your customers. And so models address the actual user pain points, not the theoretical problems. They're aligned to a rhythm. The structure matches how work naturally flows. The models fit operational cadences rather than fighting it. They're culturally respectful. The design acknowledges organizational norms and values. Now, I'm definitely one to push on this just because, if I go back to my marching band story, just because we've always done it that way, that doesn't mean it's a cultural norm, and it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be changed. So that's where the ideas need to come up. And we also need to be courageous enough to challenge the cultural norms. I'll tell you an interesting story. The gal that was in here from Best Buy is no longer in here. I think it might have been, this is like a quarter of a big, huge room. And at the time, this is probably, 2007, the big room was open. And I was standing in this room presenting to Best Buy executives. Believe it or not, Best Buy tends to lean towards a male customer. And Best Buy created an initiative that pulled in women in the community, particularly women in corporate, and said, hey, as a female, how can I get you into my store? What is interesting for you in my store? How can I make this an attractive place to be for you? How can you see yourself in this store? And the reason why I'm telling you this is because as all of those women, we came together, and there were a few hundred of us over quite a bit of period of time, gave the organization feedback on why women didn't like to be in the Best Buy store. and what they would rather see there and what's missing for them there. And I point that out because we were challenging the cultural norm within Best Buy, and they were saying, hey, we're missing a huge market segment, right? And we've always done things this way. It sort of started as sort of the bro audio shop, right? But we need to expand, and we need to expand our customer base. And so they challenged the cultural norms in how they were doing business. And they changed. It was right when like Magnolia Home Theater was coming out. That seemed a little like, hey, imagine this is your living room at home. They were appealing much more to women than they were to men in that space. And so Best Buy challenged the cultural norms of their consumers and how people performed and operated within the store. And so the design acknowledges the organizational norms and values, but also don't be afraid to challenge them and say, does it have to be this way just because it's always been this way? They are usually simple under pressure. Frameworks remain usable when teams are stressed. Actually, there's no better time to lean into a framework than when your team is stressed. And you can be feeling like, hey, remember that framework we all agreed on, we all designed together? Look, we know half our team's been laid off. Boy, we really got to lean back into the structure. Like, let's lean into that and lean on that. And so they do stand up under pressure. Adoption is a design choice. So too many leaders treat adoption as something that happens after launch, a separate phase to be managed. The adoption phase of a launch, I love it. But most successful operating models build adoption into their very structure from day one. So it's built in and not bolted on. And that really only happens when the people that the operating model is designed for are at the table designing it with you. That creates stick. And they will defend it. So when they are out in other parts of the org saying, this is how this department executes, and they were a part of designing how that happens, they will go defend it in rooms where you don't have a seat in. And so you want that to be sticky. The adoption doesn't happen after launch. It's designed to the work from the start. Usability beats completeness. A simple model people use consistently outperforms a comprehensive framework that they ignore, right? And clarity beats sophistication. Elegant complexity impresses in presentations, but it does often fail in practice. We see quickly the things that people choose to skip over and say that is just too complex for what we need. We're going to just kind of maybe cut that segment in half and only do bare minimum in that segment because it was made too complex. So we're going to start without a mandate. Frameworks, I'm a fan of frameworks built from the ground up with the people doing the work for all the reasons I just shared. The most successful operating models don't begin as grand transformations. Oh, raise your hand if you've been in an org who said, we're going to transform to Agile. And how well did it work? Yeah, right? Right? You know, Agile was built for a great software development area. Most of us don't always work in those. It's going to be some degree of hybrid. What does that look like in your org? What do we consider successful? What do we consider agile enough to deliver the result, right? And so the operating models, believe you me, don't begin as grand transformations. It's great in concept, but it really comes down to the people doing the work. How is this going to work for us? So you need to start small. You need to stay focused on one real problem that's causing genuine pain. This approach has multiple advantages. It requires less political capital. I sat with an IT leader who, and I will say this with the most compassion because we've all been in this situation, who inflicted or did Agile to the organization. No one was really on board. People are like, well, what if we're not on board with this? What if my project's really, they're regulatory in nature. I'm really waterfall. I don't think Agile is going to work for me. And this leader at the time, it was a very quick onboarding and offboarding based on the answer I'm getting ready to tell you is, if you don't like it, you can just quit. So if you don't like the idea of being Agile, you should just quit your job. And I thought, wow, what a way to inflict an execution methodology on an entire team who knows where all the dead bodies are buried and has all of that tribal knowledge that is so, so important, right? So focus on one real problem, identify specific friction pain point causing daily pain, small, focused scope. So if you're thinking organizational framework, you got to think so much smaller. The operating models and frameworks can be just pieces of processes all combined together. You can't eat that elephant in one bite. So start looking where the pain points are and start small. We need to define clear value. You've got to be able to demonstrate tangible improvement quickly. So nothing like a consulting mindset. When you come into an org and you're a high-priced consultant, you got to demonstrate value every day, right? You will gain more momentum when people can see quick wins. And so really start with what can we change for the better right away to continue to get adoption, which means you really have to demonstrate that tangible improvement quickly. And then earn the right. Use successes to justify broader scaling. All right, minimum viable framework. Don't you love MVP? This is just MVF. The concept of minimum viable applies powerfully to the operating models. Where is it just enough structure, providing sufficient framework to stabilize without over-engineering, and then learn by using them and have a willingness to shift and to change them when they're not working. And again, you'll see work is happening outside of them when they're not effective. And only then, when it is effective, do you start to scale. You need to prove the model first, right? Expand that scope only after providing value. And then iterate on the feedback. So that part does feel very agile. Refine based on the user experience and observe patterns. Avoid the rigid systems. Be a jazz improviser. Be willing to get a little creative. The over-engineering breaks. Too much structure collapses under its own weight. The intentional flexibility, that design adoption mechanisms explicitly. And then the rigidity reduces engagement. Oh, that's tough. And expect that you're going to evolve. And so change is normal, it's not failure. Flexibility must be intentional, not accidental. Build in explicit mechanisms for adaptation while maintaining core principles. I love just a group's core principles and how they agree to work together and work with their customers, and in the spirit in which they're going to get work done. Those guiding principles can be really, really important. All right, you're going to design for longevity. The leadership transitions. So you may not always be in the organization that you're in. Maybe you're a leader who built an amazing execution system. What happens when you leave? Does the execution system remain intact? Can it outlive you because you're moving on to your next phase of your career? So the models have to be able to function no matter who's in charge. When you see team turnover, the structure should enable onboarding into maintaining the model. And then can it grow and can it scale? Frameworks must adapt as the organizations evolve. So it really comes from embedding the models into the organizational, I like to call it muscle memory. And it's making the natural way work happens, not something that is imposed from above. What leadership needs to remember is that strategy needs structure. Adoption determines the impact. If the model's not adopted, you're not going to deliver value and you're not going to have the impact that you were hoping for. And so the models enable the clarity. Again, going back to that, who can you go to on a team and say, tell me how work flows through here? Can your team reflect that back to you and say, yeah, this is our intake process and we've adopted it over time and we find this is what works best in this organization. And so the best models outlive their creators. So the path forward, operating model design, isn't a one-time project. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing practice of translating strategy into structure. The journey begins with one simple question. Where is intent clear, but structure is missing? The gap between clear strategic intent and absent operational structure is where operating model design begins. It's where friction reveals opportunity, where influence can drive change, and where small interventions can create lasting impact. So key success factors. You start with real friction points. Design with users, not for them or to them, but with them. You're going to keep it simple. Make sure it can sustain some pressure. You're going to iterate based on actual usage and position as relief, not control. What it doesn't do is it doesn't impose models from above. It didn't happen in a room full of 3 leaders and no one else was included in it. You're not going to over-engineer it. You're going to treat it. You're not going to treat it as something that happens after launch. You're not going to ignore the organizational culture, and depending on the authority to enforce. So success comes from treating operating models as a craft, one that balances structure with flexibility. Okay, so your starting point is you go back to work next week and you're interested in creating some structure so that your team can have a higher level of success and feel better about coming to work every day and getting things done, is that you are going to identify the friction points. And so find where the strategy is clear, but execution breaks down. So if you've got perhaps a portfolio in part of your business where they just can't seem to make their deadlines and everything's over budget, scope creep seems to be part of their culture, is that you're wanting to find out where that execution is breaking down. And you want to understand that gap, what structure elements are missing there. And then you want to design your minimum viable, create just enough structure to stabilize the work. That team will let you know when they need more structure. But start with some and say, enough, too much, feels like too much control, feels like you've got enough, creative freedom here to get this done well. Do we need more? And if so, what do you suggest? All right. And then test and learn, implement with early adopters, and iterate and scale. That's your starting point. Structure enables strategy. Where intent is clear, but structure is missing, that's where operating model design begins. You're going to start there, you're going to start small, and you're going to start right away. Just start now. Look, it's January. You already made it into the new year. If you're going to start new initiatives, start this now. We've got a lot of work to do. There you go. Thoughts and questions? Thank you. Any questions? Oh, we've got one over here. She's going to give you the mic so that it picks up on the recording.
How do you distinguish between flexibility and workarounds?
I feel like workarounds to me happen in closed rooms where not everyone is sitting at the table. And so flexibility should include awareness for everyone to say, hey, we're finding this isn't working for 3 out of 5 teams rather than this isn't working just for our team. And so we really need to be transparent about where we're needing flexibility and saying, is this a challenge for the broader group or is it unique to just this team? And so if it's not working for the broader group, we need to revisit the model. If it is truly one team, like does this one specific team need a workaround and why? And so we have to be flexible enough. If you look at a house as a framework, there's windows and doors. So it does have room and places for work to come in and come out when needed. And so I look at, is this applicable to all the teams or is it just this one? Next question. Look at that, Lauren, it's noon. Nailed it. Thank you guys so much. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect. Thank you so much for having me here today. It was great to be with you. I hope you enjoyed your week. I've heard you're drowning in new ideas and content, and so I invite you to digest for a while before you put those into action and see how they might impact your teams. But thank you very much. It was nice to be with you today. Thanks.